I'm actually excited because tomorrow is the evening of Yom HaZikaron Shoah HaGevurah, the beginning of our kind of alternate 10 days of the alternative to the Tishrei 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. And that's what today's session and next week's session are going to focus on. Today's going to focus on the place, Mount Herzl or Har HaZikaron. And next week, I'm going to focus more on the three events, the 3 days. So starting tomorrow night, Yom HaZikaron Shoah HaGevurah, Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism, followed a week later by Yom HaZikaron LeChalalei Tzahal, for Memorial Day for fallen Israeli soldiers and victims of terror, and then immediately after Independence Day. This picture I took on my block. I know you guys live in a small town called Glencoe, and I know you have multiple places of worship in Glencoe, but on my block, I have a synagogue. Underneath me, I have another synagogue. None of them are Reform or Conservative, I might add. But this last year, just around Yom HaAtzmaut, this flag was put up, which I love because one of the themes I'll talk about, you'll see now, is this tension between what sounds the same in Hebrew, ribonut, and rabbanut. Ribonut, the one on the right in Hebrew, is literally sovereignty, and rabbanut is rabbis, as in the rabbinic rule. And if we look at thousands of years of Jewish history in 30 seconds or less, where does it begin? God might choose Abraham and the patriarchs and the matriarchs. He then delivers us out of slavery. We just told that story. I'm not going to repeat it again last week, to be a holy people. We are then led by God, Moses, Joshua into the land of Israel. The Israelites eventually, after 2.5 centuries being led by judges, ask for a king. God gives us a king, King Shaul, King Saul. And then Solomon builds a temple in Jerusalem about 3,000 years ago, administered by Kohanim, priests. The temple was destroyed, rebuilt, a second temple was built, and then finally that rebuilt version of the second temple was destroyed in 70, the Common Era, at which point Judaism, as we know it today, evolves very differently from a priestly, temple, sacrificial-based faith to a community, to a religion that is based on synagogues and rabbis and prayer. And this is where Rabbanut, the rabbinic leadership, replaces temple or priestly leadership, and that became the leading force of Jewish life wherever we lived for 2,000 years. But in the late 19th century, when modern political Zionism, Jewish nationalism was formed, all of a sudden sovereignty, the people are sovereign, like France, like we the people, your constitution, your foundational document, very different than Europe, where pre-French Revolution at least, and even after French Revolution in many places, the king or the queen was sovereign, ruling by divine rule. So there's a difference between ribonut, as I mentioned, or rabbanut, I should say here, I've circled in red, the rabbinic leadership versus ribonut, sovereignty. And that's the great thing. One of the great things about Hebrew is it's a language that is so filled with similarities, and you can understand that there's some tension between these two words. And by the way, in Israel today, 9.5 million people, there's a significant number, about 12%, the ultra-Orthodox, who don't believe that the people are sovereign. Right? The Haredi world is still opposed to Zionism and modernity, and the Haredi world believes that Rabbanut, the rabbinic leadership, interpreting God's word, should still continue to rule. So one thing before I get started is the notion of, are we sovereign? Is it the people of Israel who are sovereign, or is God still sovereign? Which, by the way, in our Siddur, we have a prayer for the state of Israel, but we also have a prayer called the Aleinu. And the Aleinu says, to remind us, Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. Right? We should give praise to the master of everything, the master of the universe. So is God, God is the master of the universe. Who's in charge, the people or God? Big tension within Israeli society. The second point, before I get started and we go visit the places, is the idea of Jewish memory. We're a people endowed with this incredible sense of memory. It goes back millennia, 2,600 years ago, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat and we wept as we remembered. It's a bit different in the Hebrew. Here in English it says thought, but in Hebrew, for those who read Hebrew, it says b'zochrenu. As we remembered Zion, we wanted to come back to Zion. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, my right hand wither, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. We say that when we get married under the chuppah to remind ourselves that the greatest moment of happiness in our life, we are to remember the destruction. We're to remember the exile, right? And that for 2,500 years, right? From the first temple destruction, and then 500 years we had the temple, the second temple, and then post-destruction of 70 of the Common Era until the late 19th century, that essentially was Jewish memory. We were punished. God exiled us, and when we behave ourselves, when God deems the time is right, He will lead us back into Eretz Yisrael, into the land of Israel. How did we stick together as a people? These two notions that I've already mentioned. The one notion of who is in charge, the rabbis or the people, and two, the question of memory. And what we, the people, have done is we reactualize memory. And my favorite line of the Seder, which we just said, or you said twice, I said once, is every generation is obliged to see oneself as if one personally went out of Egypt, or this is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. The notion that the Jewish people continue to tell the exact same story as Joseph Chaim Yerushalmi wrote in his amazing book, Zachor, Remember, Judaism tries to fuse the past and present, and memory isn't merely recollection, but reactualization. So what we try to do at the Seder table is we get our kids to try to understand what freedom and what slavery actually mean. Different than just, oh yeah, I remember. Much, much deeper than that. The notion of reactualizing memory is expressed in Israel through the construction of the memorial mountain of Har HaZikaron in Hebrew, or Mount Herzl, which incorporates three elements: the grave of Theodor Herzl, adjacent to which are the great leaders of the nation, the military cemetery, turn this off, the military cemetery, and Yad Vashem. And in one of my favorite books that I use when I guide in Europe, and he talks a lot about Israel as well in his books, the kind of Holocaust memorial, The Texture of Memory, James Young, a professor from somewhere in Western Massachusetts, I don't remember what college, he wrote, through this attention to the activity of memorialization, we might also remind ourselves that public memory is constructed. That understanding of events depends on memory's construction and their worldly consequences and the kinds of historical understanding generated by monuments. We, the people, in America, in France, in Israel, wherever we are, we create memorials to tell a particular story. We choose what stories to tell, and we also, by the way, choose what stories not to tell. And just as we sit around the Seder table, remembering slavery, and just as we sit around the Friday night table, remembering, we say in the Kiddush, Zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim, Zecher l'maseh Bereshit, as long as they're your dogs, Beth, and not mine. Although, there we go, thank you. Say hi. But we remember, and we remember the Passover Seder, and we construct sacred space. And that is where we are going this afternoon, and that is to the mountain of memory. Now, one of the narratives, or one of the core themes, I think, in the young Israeli society, you might have heard this, Beth, definitely in all your all your federation trips, that we are a people. I missed the slide here. No, there I am. That we are a people of memory, no question. And on this western ridge, 834, 2,500, 2,600 feet above sea level, here is this mountain, which is the epicenter of national observance of our three national holidays in this 10-day period, kind of parallel to, competing with, complementary to, a part of the 10 days, the Asarei Yemei Tshuva that we have from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. We start, as I said, tomorrow night, Yom HaZikaron for the Shoah, and heroism a week later, Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers, etc. The event that begins the transitions between Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers and Independence Day actually takes place at Mount Herzl. And it's there where 12 torches are lit, commemorating the 12 tribes of Israel and the ingathering of the kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of exiles from four corners of the earth. But it also symbolizes the transition from darkness of the Shoah to light in the story of our national rebirth. As I mentioned, the great leaders of the nation, Mount Herzl, the military cemetery, and finally Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. You might have heard this narrative, this theme, as I mentioned, called Mishoah l'Tkuma, right? This whole notion of this mountain, Mount Herzl, tells a story from Holocaust to rebirth. I have a problem with that because it's suggesting that the reason that the rebirth happened is because of the Holocaust. And I think that it does a disservice to everything that happened up until 1933, 1939, 1945, or 1948 even, in the Jewish state, or in the land of Israel, right? The Chalutzim in the early 20th century, the people who came in the late 19th century. We are a people of memory. We mention the word memory almost 170 times in the Torah, and it is one of the most important imperatives in Jewish tradition. And how does this story that the founding fathers and mothers created in this sacred geographic space of Mount Herzl, how do we tell that story? And as I mentioned, one of the common themes is this notion of Holocaust to rebirth. Should there really be a link between the two events? Or, is the Holocaust, and I oftentimes hear this from people who are questioning Israel's validity, that Israel is here because of the Holocaust. I challenge that and I say, actually, Israel is here despite the Holocaust. Had Israel have been born beforehand, maybe we wouldn't have had the Shoah. But that struggle against, and this is a quote from our prime minister. He wasn't quite the prime minister at the time. He became prime minister a little bit later. He was at the time the minister of finance, Levi Eshkol. The very struggle, he said, against the Nazi adversary and the victory which followed in the War of Independence laid the foundations for the revival of our national independence. Seen in this light, the Jewish fight against the Nazis in the War of Independence were in fact a single protracted battle. The geographic proximity between Yad Vashem and Mount Herzl thus expresses far more than mere physical closeness. Listen to that line. The Jewish fight against the Nazis and the War of Independence were in fact a single protracted battle. I'm not sure I'd agree with that line, but it's clear that that generation, Eshkol and Ben-Gurion and Golda, really wanted to connect the two events of the Holocaust, and it sounds well, and it rhymes in Hebrew, Shoah l'Tkuma, from Holocaust to rebirth. And this famous picture, you might have seen, I think I showed it to you in one of my previous sessions, but this famous picture of young men, survivors of Buchenwald, including my late uncle, Eli, over here. It was a stage picture, which very much, and is pretty iconic in Israel. You see it in Yad Vashem, you see it in a lot of history books of Israel, this clear linkage between the rebirth of the Jewish state and the Israeli flag, and these young men, the last remnant of their families probably, but Holocaust survivors, strong and tall and proudly carrying that flag of the state of Israel. So there has been, and maybe a little bit different today, but there's always been a link between Shoah, Holocaust, and rebirth of the state of Israel. Like the ancient Roman pantheon, and this is from a book about the American pantheon in 2004, like the Roman pantheon in the picture here, the U.S. Capitol was designed by its political and aesthetic arbiters to memorialize the virtues, events, and persons most representative of the nation's ideals, an attempt to raise a particular version of the nation's founding to the level of myth. Myth, an event that might or might not have happened, whose significance is greater than that event in and of itself. And as we saw in ancient Rome, and as you see in these pictures from the internet about Washington, the geography, the building, the architecture is designed to tell a particular story, which, as the author says, memorialize the virtues, right? There's a Lincoln Memorial, there's a Kennedy Memorial, and the changes in those memorials. The Vietnam Memorial came much later than the end of the Vietnam War, of course. The museums on the Smithsonian that are constantly being added are constantly changing, and they're reflecting. It's the Arlington Cemetery, they're constantly reflecting the change in American society. So too in Israel on this Har HaZikaron, there's the Vietnam Memorial, on this Har HaZikaron, the Mountain of Memory. And the first part of that mountain was, actually not the first part, was the second part, but the crest of that mountain, I should say, is the tomb of Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, who writes in The Jewish State in 1896, "We've honestly tried everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so." Right? Here was Herzl, a journalist in Vienna, who is at the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French captain in the general staff in Paris, and realizes that there's anti-Semitism not just in Eastern Europe under the Pale of Settlement under the Tsar, but also here in enlightened Central Western Europe, where we've been enlightened and emancipated. And he writes in this book, if you will, it is no dream. In Basel, after the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he writes in his diary, "I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this out loud today, people would laugh, but perhaps in another 5 years, certainly in another 50, everyone will recognize it." And going to the trial in 1894, writing the book in 1896, 1897, having the Zionist Congress, he wasn't far off, because in 1947, 50 years after he said this, the UN voted to recommend creating a state in Palestine. Unfortunately, Herzl dies quite young, 44 years of age, and a year before he died, he wrote the following. Where am I? A year before he died, he wrote, "I wish to be buried in a metal coffin next to my father, and to remain there until the Jewish people transfer my remains to Eretz Yisrael. The coffins of my father, my sister, and of my close relatives who will have died until then will also be transferred there." He died, buried in Vienna in 1904. In the summer of 1949, he was reinterred on the mountain. Here's a picture of him on his way to Palestine in 1898, on the mountain that posthumously was named Mount Herzl. There are pictures I found online from the funeral, Jews from across Europe coming in July of 1904. There's his original tomb in Vienna. Nobody can visit it because it's not there anymore. In 1949, one of the first acts of government was to exhume the bones of Herzl and bring them and lay them at the cemetery at Mount Herzl. And I found this amazing video when I was putting this piece together of the story of Herzl's tomb being brought to Israel, being laid in state in Tel Aviv, being laid in state in front of the, the building where the UJA and the JNF is on Karen Hayesod Street in downtown Jerusalem, and then from there, ultimately being buried on Mount Herzl. There's no sound to it. It's not me. Hold it a second. So, 1949, January, the dust is not yet settled. The War of Independence is still raging. It's the old Lod airport. It was not yet called Ben Gurion because Ben Gurion still had another 34 years of life left in it. He's being brought up to the beach in Tel Aviv. There you can see Ben Gurion and Moshe Shertok, the foreign minister. This is on the beach in Tel Aviv for those who have run. Hi, Dana. Those who have run along the beach or walked along the beach.
Hi, Mike.
This is now in Jerusalem in front of the Jewish Agency buildings. There wasn't yet a permanent Knesset at the time. Young Israeli soldiers. And there's a war still happening, right? We have not yet had armistice. And now look at Jerusalem. This is Mount Herzl. There's not much in the background of the city of Jerusalem at the time. It's being laid in the ground. And then, as Jews are buried outside of Israel, often with a sack from, sorry, I'm going to press pause here, often with a sack of soil from Jerusalem, so that they'll be familiar with what will happen at the end of days when the Messiah comes. Here you see Jews from every community in Israel were invited, and they brought from Hulda, from a kibbutz, a sack of earth from their Jewish community in Israel. Fascinating. See, everybody's putting their sacks of earth. And thus the mountain was named Mount Herzl after this very, interesting ceremony with all sorts of pomp and circumstance. Herzl was exhumed and laid down. The tomb looked like this originally. I don't know if you can see in the background, but that's Jerusalem. There's not much else in Jerusalem in 1949. Today's tomb you visited, very simple. Like all the tombs of the great leaders of the nation, it just has the name of the deceased there. And you can see in recent years, under former President Obama, although I guess he's still president, but he doesn't have any power, now he does Netflix series on national parks, which are quite good. But here you can see President Obama laying a wreath on the tomb of Herzl. So there is the President, Shimon Peres at the time, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Peres is now on the mountain as well, not too far from there. But Obama's visit here was fascinating because most presidents don't come to the old city and go to the Western Wall because of the question of the conflict with Israel and the Palestinians and the embassy and everything else. But all of a sudden, there's always been protocol that a visiting head of government or state comes to Yad Vashem and lays a wreath on the tomb in front of the eternal flame and the ashes of people taken who were murdered in Europe. But when the President of the United States comes to Mount Herzl, or the founding father of Zionism, who essentially said, we the people are sovereign, and lays a wreath there, it recognizes, I think it's a very powerful statement on behalf of the entire American nation, that the American people recognize our right to national sovereignty in Israel, which is something that I think is very, very important. And again, Obama did that. He didn't go up to the wall. He did, I think, when he was running for office, but not once he was president. And next to him are many of the great leaders, to him being Herzl and his family behind him. Here's the map of who was there. Speakers of the Knesset, the first finance minister. You can see over here Golda Meir's tomb. Golda Meir was married, but she was divorced, and so she's buried by herself. Very simple tomb. It's got her name, Golda Meir. And then recently, maybe 15 years ago, they decided to add a little bit more of the biography. It was just the name and then the Hebrew calendar date on the other side of their birth and their death, and now it describes what she was, where she was born, when she died, what her roles were in government, etc. So there's much more personalization of the tomb, in contrast to Levi Eshkol, Prime Minister in the 67 war, whose quote I read from 1962 about the linkage between Holocaust and Mount Herzl, between Holocaust and Israeli independence. Yitzhak Rabin and his wife Leah on the left-hand side over there, their graves are unique on Mount Herzl because he was the only prime minister who was murdered because of his opinions, in contrast to all the others who died of cancer, heart attack, heaven forbid, old age, or whatever else. What's happened in recent years? Much more personalization, which didn't begin with Shimon Peres when he died in 2016, but definitely there's a lot added to it. So on his tombstone, there's a biblical quote on one side, there's a quote from Ben Gurion on another, and then an extract by an Israeli poet, which describes him as a statesman, a lover of books, poetry, and art, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, visionary, and pragmatist. So the old version of the tombs, 15 years ago, would say Shimon Peres in the Hebrew calendar date of his birth and his death. Now on the front, there's a whole big plaque in very small print for Shimon Peres because he had a lot of roles and responsibilities in his career. And on one side, you can see there is a quote from Ben Gurion, Dmuta Ruchanit, the spiritual image, or the spiritual character, of Israel and its strength and its internal strength will be in the future the central factor in its security and in its international position, its international situation. This is from David Ben Gurion. And then a quote from the Bible, Isaiah, can you guess? And they shall turn their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, nation shall not raise sword against nation anymore. Fascinating. We went from, in a generation, a tomb which had the name of the deceased president, prime minister, Hebrew birth and death date, to this biography in the front, short biography, to all sorts of quotes chosen by the deceased or by the family. In this case, a quote by from the Bible, interesting, for Shimon Peres, a secular person, of course, and a quote from Ben Gurion. Next to, as we transition into the second part of this mountain, the military cemetery, is a small section you might have visited, and this tomb actually is this tomb, right? This is a close-up from my camera here. This is the tomb of Chana Senesh, one of 36 young men and young women who parachuted, joined in the Palmach in 1942-43 in Palestine, trained with the British, and parachuted. Enzo Tzerani was another woman, Chaviva Reich, you might have visited Givat Chaviva. This institute is named after her. They parachuted behind the enemy lines. She was 23. There was no military in Israel yet. There was no Tzahal, right? We weren't 1948. Notice the parachute, the shape on the left of some of them are tombs. 1, 2, 3 are tombs. These 4 over there are memorials, because we don't know where the bodies are buried, what happened to them, where they were killed in the camps in Europe. And they're shaped like a parachute. Here you can see the parachute as well. And you'll notice the symbol on the right. It says Haganah in Hebrew. They're part of the Haganah, not the Palmach, my mistake. And there is a sword and an olive branch. Later on, that symbol of the Haganah becomes the central symbol, you'll see in a couple minutes, of the IDF, which is the symbol of all of the tombs in the military cemetery. Just around the corner from there begins the military cemetery of so many of those people who died. Again, the number in Israel, I want to say, is somewhere about 24,000 so far, unfortunately, since really the end of the 19th century, trying to fulfill Theodor Herzl's vision of Zionism. And it opened just before Theodor Herzl's remains were interred. The first soldiers were already buried there, people who died fighting for Jerusalem and its environs, as there was no access to the traditional cemetery on the eastern edge of the Mount of Olives, controlled by Judaism. In many ways, as I mentioned at the beginning, this section, thousands of young men, particularly some women, but mostly men here, who died fighting for Jerusalem in 1948, in many ways symbolizes that transition of Rabbanut to Ribonut, from rabbinic leadership for 1900 years of exile, waiting for God to send us back to the land of Israel with the Messiah, to Ribonut, celebrating and mourning, unfortunately, the idea of individual, of the people as a sovereign. So keep in mind that idea, Ribonut to Rabbanut. Here you can see the typical tombs. These are people, you can see their ages, 20, 25, and it says their name. There is the symbol of the Israel Defense Forces. And you'll see it's very uniform in the early generations until about 15 years ago, actually, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The date, the place they died. This is a collective grave of people who died in a battle together. All of these people died B'krav al Kastel, fighting for the Kastel, that beautiful hilltop fortress just on the edge, the western edge that we see as we make our way up to Jerusalem. And here, last year, I believe, I made a short little video as I walked through Mount Herzl just in springtime, just really a couple days before Memorial Day. But notice the uniformity. Every grave is identical, right? The inscription, the name, the birth date, the date, the year, the age they were when they were killed, the symbol of the IDF. Right now, it's got the sword and the olive branch, and it's got the Magen David, the Star of David, around it. This little box is for a Ner Tamid, lit on Memorial Day or on the yahrzeit of the death of the individual buried there. Person was born. I'm looking. This person was born in the United States. This is the tomb of Yonatan Netanyahu, older brother of former Prime Minister Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu. He died at 30 years of age. He was the commander of the raid on Entebbe. On when? On the 4th of July, 1976. Your American bicentennial. He was the commander of the group that went into the heart of Africa and rescued the Jews and Israelis as well as Jews from outside of Israel. Next to him is, you'll see in a second, is David Elazar, the former commander-in-chief of the IDF. And there is his decoration of Medal of Valor. But it's interesting because all the tombs are the same. This guy's the general, the commander, and you can't achieve a rank higher than him. He was the general commander of the IDF in the Yom Kippur War, born in Yugoslavia, died 2 years after the fiasco of the Yom Kippur War. And that structure in the back is the latest edition. I'm looking at you, Beth, but I don't know if you've been there because it only opened in 2017. We'll see that up close in a few minutes' time. But I wanted you to get a sense of the uniformity, as I mentioned beforehand, the enormity of the cemetery. Every city, by the way, has its own military cemetery. Even the town that I live in, Modi'in, 100,000 people. We're 25 years old. We have a military cemetery. Anybody who dies in action, in training, unfortunately, too many people die in training, in accidents while they're in military service. A kid from my kid's high school in town was killed a few years ago coming home while he was in the military, crossing the highway, and was killed in a traffic accident. So we have two people who were killed 2014, the last major war in Gaza, a lieutenant colonel and a major in our town who were buried. Every city has its own cemetery, but Jerusalem is the biggest. A, it is the biggest population of the country, and B, Jerusalem also has huge numbers of people who died fighting for it in 1947 to 49, the War of Independence. But in recent years, a number of new memorials have been added, like this one. What happened between 41 and 45? There was no Israel yet. What's going on? If you look closely, you'll notice there is a memorial for 200,000 people, and it says in Hebrew and it says in Russian, in memory of the 200,000 Jews. There are 500,000 to 600,000 Jews who fought with the Red Army against Nazi Germany in what they call the Great Patriotic War. We call it the Second World War, 39 to 45. For them, it's the Great Patriotic War when the Nazis attacked them in 41, ending in May 8th. We call it May 9th, but May 8th, or so they call it May 9th, we call it May 8th, in 1945. Now, what is this doing here at the National Cemetery, the military cemetery? Because it's part of Israel's story. There are now 1 million plus people, 1.5 million probably, and their descendants who immigrated here from the former Soviet Union since the late 1980s. What about this? These are Jews, get this as a memorial for Jews who died in the Polish army. Polish army. Well, we always thought that all Poles hated all Jews and vice versa. Well, there were tens of thousands of Jews who died fighting for the Polish army. It says right over here, right, to the memorial of the Jewish soldiers fallen in the service of the Polish armies. What's that doing here? Where else is it going to be? Right? Jews, as Herzl said, endeavored to be as a part of, as Jews are in America, the host society in which they lived. And so we want to tell the story of Jews, not just who were murdered in the Shoah, that's around the corner, but we also want to tell the story of Jews who fought for countries that we don't oftentimes think that Jews fought for, but 200,000 Jews, I mean, that's enormous. That's 9 times as many Jews were killed fighting in the Red Army against Nazis as were killed in all of the wars that Israel has had since the late 19th century. Pretty crazy. Another recent addition, 20 plus years ago, is a memorial to the victims of terror. There are thousands, over 3,000 Jews who have been killed since late 19th century in all sorts of terror incidents. And you'll notice, and they're all buried in the cemeteries and the communities in which they live. But if Mount Herzl is this national site of memory, this mountain with these 3 components, we want to make sure that there's sacred space that tells the story. Here, for example, these are all the people who were killed in the year 2000. These are plaques with lots of names on them. This was the second Intifada, of course. 1,300 people were killed between 2000 and 2014. They're buried somewhere else, but part of our national narrative is told there. And then there's another edition that came in the last 15, 16 years, in 2007, a memorial to Jews who fell en route from Ethiopia. We all remember Operation Moses in 84, Operation Solomon in 1991. Jews are still coming, by the way, from Ethiopia. And at Mount Herzl, 15 years ago, they decided to create a memorial, beautiful imagery, of the tents that rural Jews lived in Ethiopia, in the northern region of Gondar in particular. And these are modeled after matzevot with names of individuals and quotes and stories. We don't know the numbers, 5,000, 10,000, thousands of Jews died walking, or were killed, some of them, on their way from Ethiopia to Israel in the 1980s and 1990s. Where are you going to tell that story? That is an important part of our story, the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Here is the place it's going to be told. When my youngest son was in the Air Force a year ago, he actually asked me, what was I doing next week? And I said, not much, because there was Corona and I wasn't guiding for 2 years. So I said, well, we can do a day of education next week. You want to take us? I said, with pleasure. So he said, what can we do? I said, well, it's just before Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers. Let's do Mount Herzl, but let's do something else. So I went up to Mount Herzl. It was him and his team. There were like 12, three women and 9 guys. And we walked around. And one of his colleagues is a guy from Ethiopia. And I recognized his name, which is, they'll call each other by their last name. My son is Hollander, not Matan. And I said, so Adisu, oh, look, there's your name. Do you want to tell us your story? No. Can you read any Amharic? No. And I realized he either intentionally didn't know the language. He was born in Ethiopia. He came here 20 years ago, but it's part of his story and it's part of our story as the Jewish people. And therefore, if we're going to incorporate that into our narrative, remember we were strangers in Egypt. Remember we struggled to get here and some of us died on the way. Where are you going to tell that story? We're going to tell that here on Mount Herzl. And another transition, which you'll see in the last slides of Mount Herzl, is the personalization of the tombs. Remember the tombs I showed you originally? There was just this, which is, you can't see it in this picture, but it was just the name of the very basic biographical story of the individual, their birthplace, the year that they died, son of, daughter of, whatever. And now, because of an appeal of the Supreme Court, where parents and family and relatives and friends wanted to personalize the story. So here you've got quotes, right? There's a quote, there's her name, Hila. This is a young woman who died a few years ago in uniform while she was helping set up the tribunes, the stands at Mount Herzl for the ceremony ending Memorial Day and transitioning into Independence Day. Here's another soldier of a guy, David Papian. Interesting, it says here, is a picture of David as there's a picture of Hila. And notice the language here. This is Armenian. He is an immigrant from Armenia, the former Soviet Union, Jewish guy. David Papian, it says he came to Israel in 1990, right? And he fell in Gaza in 2008. So there's a big transition in the past, I want to say 12, maybe 15 years, to much more personalization. Here you can see more of the flags from the Paratroop Brigade. This guy was into surfing. You can see, obviously, when he wasn't and paying with his life, unfortunately, when he wasn't serving, he enjoyed life, like the beach, enjoyed beer once in a while. And it says here, Ani lefachot hishtadalti, I at least tried. Go in peace and remember to live to love, and to smile. Lilik, that's his name, his nickname that his friends put up there. This soldier of Michael, this tomb of Michael Levine, many of you might have seen a lone soldier who volunteered from Pennsylvania and was killed in one of the last days of the last war in Lebanon in 2006, and has become a shrine for a lot of kids on programs and Masa programs and teen programs as well, because it allows people, I believe, to identify, if everything is the same and there's no room for any individual expression, then I think you lose a lot of understanding of the meaning of the loss of each of these individuals. And so the story of Asher, a young immigrant from Ethiopia, or maybe even born in Israel, the story of Michael, much more individual stories. The last piece on Mount Herzl that I want to talk about opened in 2017. I've only been in it maybe 2 or 3 times because of Corona. And I was there this is actually from the website, but I took another video you might see if I have time. Opened 5 years ago, and in it is a series of blocks. Each block is the name of one soldier who died on the particular date. So here you can see the 25th of March, 2019, the 22nd of March, the 17th of March, 31st of March. It's got their name, Alex Masami Saski, Yaniv Yitzchak El Roi, and then it's got the Hebrew date. And on the date that they died, if it's that day that you're visiting this memorial, there is a Yortzeit candle here that is lit up. And it's this massive structure you'll see in the video, which gives space to allow the names of each of the individuals to be presented here inside this new memorial. And again, no voice. So that's the roof. There are no names of the individuals, right up to the sun. The sun shines in. And the lower level where you walk in a spiral, as you walk in, you see these are all bricks with names of individual soldiers. The first time I was there, it was one of the days of the Yom Kippur War. And it was the second day, and there were like 300 candles lit up because so many people were killed on that day.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
I figure since there's only 6 of us, we could ask questions. So if people have bricks with their names on them here, do they also have graves at Mount Herzl or those local cemeteries?
Yes, but because they're all over the country, right, from the north to the south, the cemeteries, this is the one place where the Ministry of Defense decided to create this memorial that is a shared space for all the victims of all the wars in Israel.
Yeah.
So, for example, on Memorial Day next week, there will be ceremonies at every school in the country. There will be ceremonies at every military cemetery in the country. And at this cemetery, Mount Herzl, now in front of this memorial, the Prime Minister, the Commander-in-Chief of the IDF, the President will come, and they will deliver a speech on the outside area. You can't quite see it down over there. They'll deliver a speech, and that'll be a significant part at the main 11 a.m. siren on the day of Memorial Day. That takes place right on this in this particular space. But as I say, each town, so in my little town of Modi'in, there were no battles that were fought here. I'll go to the next slide, sorry. There were no battles. Actually, there were some nearby, but why is this doing this? Go into full screen. But the main state ceremonies take place at Mount Herzl, and families, friends of the deceased will make a pilgrimage up to the tomb of that particular soldier in that particular place. Here is a story of an amazing mezuzah, army mezuzah that actually was taken down from, it was the first mezuzah that was put up in the old city after reunification in 1967, and a quote from Isaiah, for Jeremiah, I earnestly remember him still. So very powerful. I can tell you, I walked through there the first time and I stopped not only to see those 200, 300 plus names I mentioned and the candles lit up on the second or third day of the Yom Kippur War. But also when I was there, I noticed names of 3 soldiers who my son knew, my eldest son, because he was in Gaza in 2014, and he was actually involved in the rescue of those soldiers who his unit who were attacked, and 3 of the young men died. So I never met any of them, but those were my son's peers and his friends. So it's a small country, and I think what this new memorial in its interesting architectural style does is it allows us to kind of understand the enormity. Each of those bricks in the wall are another life. Each one is an individual life with so many people that they connected with and they impacted on. Anyway, so the 3 parts I mentioned: the top of the hill, Theodor Herzl; next to him, the great leaders of the nation, past presidents and prime ministers, Peres, Golda, we met. On one side is the military cemetery, and the other side is Yad Vashem. Now, Yad Vashem was created by law in 1953. Israel is only 5 years old, and it decides in Jerusalem to create this memorial site, which commemorates lots of different elements. The first, of course, is to commemorate the 6 million Jewish people who died, right? And there's sometimes people come to Yad Vashem and they say, wait a minute, what about the Sinti and Roma? What about the LGBT, homosexual community? They would have said back in the 1930s and 40s. What about, it's exclusively about the Jewish story, as is the Holocaust Museum and the Smithsonian. I've seen it once, but I think almost all of it tells the story and if I remember correctly, the Illinois Holocaust Museum as well. It's about specifically the Holocaust or the Shoah. And there may be temporary exhibits in many of these museums that touch on other stories, right? But there's not a lot of mention about other chapters because tens of millions of people were murdered because of Nazism. But Yad Vashem exclusively established to commemorate the memory of the 6 million. Lots and lots of other pieces. Don't read all of this, but what's fascinating is the other important piece that I always talk about when I'm there: the high-minded Gentiles who risked their lives to save Jews. Story. The last time was the Yad Vashem was on Monday of last week with a family from Atlanta. And as we went there, and we went to the historic museum, and the mother said to me, listen, I want afterwards to find the trees. What tree? Sure, it's a tree. Yes, my sister is married to a man whose father is a Holocaust survivor. So I go to the entrance of the Yad Vashem, they type in the name, and sure enough, there's the map. And we spent 5 minutes looking for it opposite the car, which you'll see in a few minutes. At the edge of Yad Vashem, we found the tree, and she told her daughters the story of how their cousin's grandfather and sibling were saved by this woman, by these two Christian people in France. And now they're a family of 30 or 40 or 50 people or whatever it is. Very important part of Yad Vashem is the story of the righteous amongst the nations. And of course, the name of the place, Yad Vashem, there it is in Hebrew, literally a monument and a name. God says to the prophet Isaiah, even those who have no biological descendants, I will ensure that I will preserve them. There'll be a place and their name will be preserved. And one of the main responsibilities you'll see of Yad Vashem is to try to list the name of all of the 6 million victims. The Yad Vashem evolved from 1953. Originally, this building over here was the historic museum, the small little building over here. And then in 1995 to 2005, $100 million in a decade later, this new museum, which you've all visited, I don't know if we can still call it a new museum because it opened in March of 2015. That's 2005. That's 17 years ago. It's not so new anymore, but very different than the old version of Yad Vashem. The site is still the site. Lots of architecture changes, but perhaps most significantly is Moshe Safdie's 180-meter long, 10 rooms, underground, except for the first part, which is precipitously perched over the edge, intentionally, which tells the story of Jewish life in Europe before Hitler came to power, and the last part, which cantilevers out to look out to the Kastel, the same area on Mevaseret Zion, where that young soldier I pointed out was killed, with a group of soldiers were killed in the 1949 War of Independence. It's continuing to develop. Again, I was there last week, and somebody asked me, what's that? And I read the sign and it said, the Bessie and Chaim Cohen, whatever it was. But I just constantly developing it. And the question people always asked is, why did Yad Vashem change? Like, what changed about it? I'll get back to that. And if I don't, then please, Beth, remind me in a minute when I get to my last slide in Yad Vashem. You all probably remember the Ohel Yizkor, the Memorial Hall, which is the place where heads of government, heads of state come. They lay a wreath. There, you can see there's a slab. Under the slab is ash taken from sites of mass murder of Jews in Europe. this was the first part of Yad Vashem, and in many ways, I think architecturally, it endeavored to replace the temple, to suggest, as Levi Eshkol said in 1962, our finance minister, that there is a connection between Holocaust and the rebirth of the state of Israel. And in a sense that these people over here are reminding us through the flame, the eternal flame that goes to heaven, are reminding God of what happened not that long ago and not that far away from here. And some would suggest that this eternal flame is replacing that flame that connected the temple and earthly Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, thousands and thousands of years ago. As you make your way into Yad Vashem, it is still there, this avenue of the righteous amongst the nations. Very important part of Yad Vashem. Total different segue. You know what's happening in Ukraine, obviously. You know what's happening in Poland. You might be aware, I don't know if any of you have been to the Krakow JCC in the past 12 years since it opened. You've been there, Beth? And you know Jonathan Ornstein, the director, of course. And I just spoke to a friend of mine who's an educator, and she actually did a rabbinic. They have a Hartman Institute has a kind of non-denominational rabbinic ordination. She did that, and now she's pursuing getting it through the reform movement. Anyway, she was just there before I got on with you guys. I spoke to her, my friend Lana, and we were talking about the challenge of trying to deliver assistance to anybody, Jews as well as non-Jews, through this JCC in Krakow, which was not designed to do that, bizarre as it sounds. But what's amazing is that 2 hours ago, I saw on Facebook that the director, Jonathan Ornstein, was meeting the son of Sugihara, the Japanese consul and countess in Kovno in the early 1940s, who forged thousands of family visas, allowing thousands of Lithuanian Jews to leave. And in October of last year, the son came here to Jerusalem, and he dedicated there's a park or a garden or whatever, a square, a street in his father's honor, and he spoke about it. And Jonathan was there today meeting the son. And it turns out that the rabbi, Avi Baumel, who was originally American, is the rabbi of Krakow and the rabbi in the JCC. And Avi Baumel, the rabbi's father, was one of the people saved by Council Sugihara. And this family alone is 61 people. So if 4,000 false papers were sent by Sugihara, and this family has 61 descendants, you multiply 4,000 by 50, 60, you understand how enormous the righteous act of Sugihara was, and Oskar Schindler and so many others, 26,000 in number so far, righteous amongst the nations. That's individuals who are recognized for saving at least one Jewish life in those dark years. 1987, the first change began at Yad Vashem with the launching or the opening of the Children's Memorial. You've all probably been through there. Fascinating because you hear the names of individual children, their ages, and the places that they come from in Europe, filled with all sorts of architectural symbolism. You come out and you see this amazing sculpture of that great Jewish educator and physician, Janusz Korczak, embracing the children. And it very different in 87 from the museum, because up until that point, the museum did not mention names of any individual Jews. The old museum tells the story from the perspective of the perpetrator. The new museum tells the story from the perspective of the victim. A lot more stories of the individuals in the museum. 5 years after the Children's Memorial opens, the Valley of the Communities opens. Originally, it was called the Valley of the Lost Communities. You can see, right? It's not a sloppy job of the people who wrote this, but there was another word here. It used to say the lost communities. But then people said, what do you mean lost communities? There are 5,000 Jews in Poland. Hundreds of them are helping in Krakow as we speak at the JCC, these asylums, these refugees coming in from the Ukraine. What about the Jews in Paris? What about the Jews in Berlin? The blossoming Jewish community in Berlin. Jewish life isn't dead. The communities aren't lost. They've changed, obviously. But this valley, carved out in the shape of a map of Europe, was designed to give people a sense of the enormity of loss from the perspective of the communities, because the names on the walls aren't names of people, but are names of community. There is Warsaw. Warsaw is a city that had 350,000 Jews, over 300,000 of whom were murdered in the Holocaust. That is 1.5 times, if my math is right, the size of Chicago's Jewish community. That was an enormous, thriving community. And so you walk through this in the 90s saying, oh, wow, you get an understanding of the enormity of the Shoah. That's 1992. Then a train car, which you know in the Holocaust, in Illinois Holocaust Museum and in Washington and Dallas and many other places, there's a train car. But the train car in Yad Vashem is different. It's separate. It's isolated from the rest of of the Yad Vashem. You can't actually get to it. There's a glass wall there in front of you. In the distance, you look out and you see the Hadassah Hospital. And as you walk from the main museum complex down to the train car, you pass through this garden of the righteous amongst the nations. There's no more space to plant any more trees, and so they have a garden where their plaques. I was there a couple years ago, actually, with a guy from Chicago, Dr. Avi, I forget his last name, and he told the story of how his father was saved by a Polish righteous amongst the nation. We went to see the plaque. He told the story. Yad Vashem, why? And these are pictures I secretly snuck with my camera. Don't tell anybody. You're not supposed to take pictures in Yad Vashem. I was there once 5 years ago. A Thursday afternoon, they're open until like 7 or 8 in the evening. It was the winter, twilight time. Took this picture as I was leaving Yad Vashem. I took this picture, crazy, on my phone as I entered Yad Vashem. Why does the new museum open in 2005? It's not that the Shoah changes. We've changed. Israel realizes in 1995 that there are two major changes in America. One, a movie called Schindler's List, as a result of which Steven Spielberg sets up the Shoah Foundation and chronicles and endeavors to find all survivors to give visual testimony to their story. And second is something on the Smithsonian, right? The American Holocaust Museum. And Israel said, wait a minute, we can't let America do things better than we do, one. And two, how we tell the story. What, not just the methodology of the story, but what components of the story we're going to tell are very important. So as I mentioned, the old Yad Vashem and its very clear historic narrative, black and white pictures taken by the perpetrators, was absent of any individual reference of any of the Jews. It was the Jews. The new Yad Vashem, when it opened in March of 05, the chairman of the board, Avner Shalev, said very clearly, let this new museum tell the story of the individuals. And as you walk through, there are thousands of stories, individual testimonies on video, right? Diaries, pictures of family, personal belongings, personal effects that don't recreate, heaven forbid, the Shoah, but allow us to understand the tragedy from an individual perspective. Very different than the previous Yad Vashem, because we are different today. And as part of this mountain of memory, the military cemetery and the Tomb of the Great Leaders and Yad Vashem, the story today is very different. And the last room, before you leave the historic museum, this Hall of Names, you see as you enter in Hebrew and then in English, the biblical quote from Isaiah, why it is called a monument and a name. And as you look up at the ceiling, and many of you have been there, I know, you see incredibly 600 visual images, pictures of individuals or couples murdered in the Shoah. Young and old, men and women, God-fearing ultra-Orthodox, God-hating Marxist. And you try to visualize and try to understand, what if we had a picture of each of those 6 million victims? Right? Behind them are the shelves with binders, and there are 4 million names and virtual matzevot, virtual tombstones that have whatever biographical information we have of those individuals there. And if we were to have one picture for each of the victims of the Shoah, we would have to have 10,000 rooms just like this, each with 600 images up on the ceiling. So Yad Vashem, the third component, it is gone and it's continuing to go through lots and lots of changes. But before I turn over to some questions, and I see there's one in the chat, but I haven't looked at it yet, my favorite Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai, wrote a poem specifically about the mountain we just visited and its three components. The tomb of Herzl at the crest, brought in 1949 as one of the first acts of parliament, reinterred on top of the mountain, posthumously named after him. Around him, next to him, many of our great prime ministers and presidents. On one side of the mountain, the military cemetery, and Yad Vashem on the other side of the mountain. When one comes to Israel, you come to Jerusalem. And when you come to Jerusalem, you must visit the old city. And you must see the Western Wall and the Southern Wall excavations in the city of David and the Holy Sepulchre and the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and understand why the city is so important, why it's such an important repository of ancient memory for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But you do a disservice to the modern state of Israel if you don't spend at least a morning at one, if not all, of these three components on the Mountain of Memory, because it's these three chapters, the vision of Herzl and the leadership of our past presidents and prime ministers, the heavy price we continue to pay for our existence in this neighborhood, and the heavy price of not having a Jewish state paid for the 6 million victims of the Shoah, that allow you to understand the importance of the contemporary state of Israel as well. Two sides of the same coin. Here's Amichai about our mountain. Let the memorial hill remember instead of me. That's what it's here for. Let the park in memory of remember. Let the street that's named for remember. Let the well-known building remember. Let the synagogue that's named after God remember. Let the rolling Torah scroll remember. Let the prayer for the memory of the dead remember. Let the flags remember, those multicolored shrouds of history. The bodies they wrapped have long since turned to dust. Let the dust remember. Let the dung remember at the gate. Let the afterbirth remember. Let the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens eat and remember. Let all of them remember so that I can rest. In a place where, as I mentioned at the beginning, we, the Jewish people, are endowed with a sense of memory, perhaps more than any other people on the planet. And there is a biblical imperative to remember, 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 remember. Here I am just spending an hour telling you about the importance of Har HaZikaron, the mountain of memory. But yet at the same time, there is a very heavy burden of constantly being in a place where we have to remember. And maybe it's too much for us to remember. And Amichai, more than many of us in this conversation probably, who came as a young boy from Germany, fought in the War of Independence, fought in the '67 war, was a friend and contemporary of Yitzhak Rabin, but he, more than most of us, realizes the importance of memory, but also the burden and that heavy challenge of living in a place that is so rich with memory of their peers, in Amichai's case at least. And with that, I end, because next week we're going to talk about sacred time. The three festivals that I mentioned are Yamim Noraim, our days of awe in our Israeli national holidays.
Mike, you are amazing. Truly.
I did it an hour. No, I'm kidding. Thank you, Andy.
It's incredible. I don't know how you do it, but you do it. And we are so grateful to you. Thank you so much.
All right, but somebody
guys.
notice somebody did something in the chat. Sorry. Oh, the cookbooks. Dana, what cookbooks? What you talking about?
She'll tell you.
At Yad Vashem, they have those. You were talking about
yes.
how they've tried to personalize it.
Yeah,
They have those cookbooks
Crazy.
where, like, the women talked about their favorite foods. I never thought I would get up from the fetal position after I saw that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there is one other thing, and I'll maybe end with this if I can, Wendy, and that is a story of one of the survivors. Pesach Adler is his name, Rabbi, and it's just before the cookbooks, Dana. And he tells the story of how we were young boys, we were in Mauthausen, and somebody said, one of the boys to the other, he said, oh, tonight it's the 14th of the Nisan, it's Erev Pesach, we got to tell the story. So we didn't tell the story. We don't have any matzah, we don't have any maror. And, you know, we were kids in yeshiva, he said, and we told the story. Halach ma'anya, he says, oh, they're bread of affliction, we don't even have bread. And it was, they told the whole story. And then he said, and at the end, we ended by saying, B'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. And he said, and I was one of the few who next year, literally, he survived, he got to Jerusalem. And then, and he's smiling, and I have this visual in my mind, he's smiling, he's putting skippah on his head. And he says, yeah, people that ask me a lot, like, how is it that I smile all the time? He said, because if I didn't smile, I'd probably be crying all of the time. And I'm always reminded of that story because it's Pesach, which we just celebrated, and that notion of memory, right? It's incumbent upon us to remember the good things, right? Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, yes, we remember the Exodus, but we also remember slavery. And that, I think, is the challenge of a people that is endowed with such an incredible sense of memory. We want to remember the positive, and we have to remember the negative as well. And with that is a segue to next week. So hopefully I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you,
Thank
Mike.
you.